Hi, and welcome to our new podcast, Big Deep. My name is Jason Elias, and along with my good friend Paul Kelway, we've created a show about people who have a deep connection to the ocean. Just a quick note before we start. After you've listened, if you like what we're doing, please subscribe, like, comment, and rate our show in iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Those subscribes, likes, and comments really make a difference for our show. Okay, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy what we've created. Welcome to Big Deep. Hi, and welcome to the Big Deep podcast. Big Deep is a podcast about people who have a connection to the ocean. People for whom that connection is so strong, it defines some aspect of their life.
Over the course of the series, we'll talk to all sorts of people. And in each episode, we'll explore the deeper meaning of that connection.
In this episode, we speak with a professor of human geography whose freediving experiences opened him to deeper parts of himself and the world's oceans.
Hello, this is Paul Kelway.
And I'm Jason Elias.
Welcome to the Big Deep podcast.
Over the course of our series, both Paul and I will be interviewing interesting people we've come across who are in some way deeply connected to the world's oceans. In essence, something they've done has caught our attention, and so we reached out to them to talk a bit more about what they do and why they feel so connected to the water. Our first guest is Michael Adams, a professor of human geography at the University of Wollongong in Australia. When Paul sat down to speak with him, they discussed how freediving had changed his entire way of looking at things, from Aboriginal views on connections to nature to meditative takes on his own mortality.
Most of my work has been around relationships between indigenous people and environments. It meant that I spent a lot of time in the bush with Aboriginal people. And throughout that time, Aboriginal people were continuously teaching me about sacred and spiritual relationships to land. It always happened that people would be talking to me about the significance of wind, of birds, ancient stories connected to places. My focus and my training as an academic is to use your head. But what these situations were telling me was to use my heart in learning about my place amongst these places.
When the indigenous communities talk about sacred and when they talk about country, what is their relationship to the elements, to that environment?
People see themselves as fundamentally integrated into country. Whereas in Western scientific training, it's partly how we define nature as places where humans are not. Aboriginal people don't hold that view at all. People see themselves as being part of this integrated community of other beings, which have an equal status in some ways to people. And here, I live on the southeast coast now, people here call themselves Saltwater People, Aboriginal people, and they talk about sea country as being part of their traditional territories. So not a distinct division between marine and terrestrial in the way that we tend to do in the West.
You talked a little bit about your methods and perhaps your methods changed somewhat at this point. How did this experience then lead you to deeper exploration of the ocean?
I took on full immersion where you attempt to become the thing that you are researching and to think about what was involved for me personally when I did that, when I hunted in the ocean as a spearfisher. Like one of the things Aboriginal people say is, why would you just restrict your knowledge of the world to your intellect? Why wouldn't you also think about your emotional responses, your dreams, your intuitions, the whole sphere of engagement with the world? So I have dived for a long time in a fairly casual way, essentially harvesting food from the oceans. But when I started to think more about how I was in the ocean from the lessons from indigenous people, it opened up a whole new series of understandings. Then 3 or 4 years ago, I went to a freedive centre on the north coast of Bali in Indonesia. And that first introduction to thinking about depth and sustained time underwater and understanding not just the physiology of your body, but the way that you need to work with your mind was extremely interesting. The idea that when you're freediving, it's a very meditative process. It's about being as quiet and calm and empty as possible when you're underwater. I then dived in Hawaii with a very legendary diver called Carlos Isles. So Carlos Isles is 75 or 76. He's dived all his life. He's written half a dozen books, and he dived in ways that no one will ever be able to dive again. The way he swam with sharks in places where sharks are now massively depleted. He's skinny, deeply tanned, pretty sort of battered looking. And when he taught me in Panau Bay below the volcano, we didn't talk about safety, we didn't talk about technique. He just said, look, I want you to watch what I do and then copy my movement. We sat on the rocks at the foot of those volcanoes and talked about philosophy for an hour before we dived. And then we just swam together for about a mile out to sea, effectively. So when you swim 100 metres off the rocky lava shore, you can be in 100 metres depth of water. And the first time I did that, I'd never been in water that deep, and I actually found it pretty scary. One of his lessons to me was that you have to throw away those imagined fears. Yes, there are real dangers, but you don't want to bring those monsters from your cultural upbringing out into the sea with you. It's about letting go of those fears, letting go of the numbers, the minutes of breath hold, the meters of depth. Don't think about that. Just try and empty your mind and become one of all those other creatures that you see and experience in those warm tropical waters. And those waters are amazing. There are spinner dolphins around us. We're listening to the crackle of shrimp. We see many, many fish, turtles, all kinds of marine things in this intensely biological environment. But it's also amazing blue depth as you move further offshore, and it just drops away into darkness below your fins. I think that was the single strongest lesson to me from Carlos. He says the ocean is a nonlinear system. It's about a much more meditative approach, a much more unstructured, throwing away your acculturated intellectual thinking about all these things and opening yourself to the experience of being in this deep blue water, which extends across the planet. All oceans in the world are connected. It's the world ocean. You're actually in this vast body of water which covers 71% of the planet. Also the sense that the salt water goes all the way through you, that you carry within your body these versions of the ocean, the blood in your veins, tears in your eyes, the sweat on your skin. That salt water is continuous with the salt water that you're swallowing and tasting in your mouth and rinsing through your sinuses. When you start thinking like that you are this tiny speck in this immensity of blue which extends across every continent, across the whole sphere of the planet. In some senses, the correct responses are through poetry and meditation rather than through science and calculation.
You mentioned fear, and freediving, of course, has an element where you are literally putting yourself on the edge at times. So I wonder if you could maybe speak to that as far as safety and fear and even contemplations on death.
Once I started training in freediving, I was Googling around to see what had been published on freediving. And there's quite a bit on the physiology of freediving and almost nothing on the cultural or embodied experiences of diving. So I decided I was going to focus on this. I interviewed divers. I looked at a lot of literature through the kind of freediving communities. And then last year, kind of threw out all of the academic approaches I'd been using and tried to write in a more kind of lyrical way to try and honour what I was feeling in the experience. And what had happened just prior to that, I had come across my father's death certificate. My father killed himself when I was 14, and I knew very little about that event. And in my diving, I had been increasingly aware of how close diving brings you to death in the kind of the risk sense. But the really interesting thing was that it wasn't at all frightening. It wasn't about an adrenaline rush of being close to death. It was this very peaceful, connected feeling of being unafraid of being close to death. And that's what the freediving was doing, reminding me of how vulnerable we are as living beings on the planet, as well as how strong we are. That connection, our kind of joy and strength in swimming in the ocean, and our incredible vulnerability in the face of engaging with the biggest thing on the planet, was a key to working through my thoughts on this.
Just speaking to a very personal experience of almost sort of processing your own family experience around death, how has this engagement in the water, this sort of relating to fear in that environment, how has that helped you with that processing of that personal experience?
Well, when you're underwater, fear is not good. Physiologically, it kicks in adrenaline that chews oxygen. It gets you ready to fight or flee, and you can't do either of those things underwater. In freedive training, a large amount is about letting go of your mind. If there are thoughts of fear coming in, just looking at them and letting them go past. One of the lessons, Jimmy, from my many, many indigenous teachers and from freediving is that death and life, it's two sides of the coin. Every living thing dies. We all die. Our continued lives depend on the deaths of other living things in what we eat to sustain ourselves. I don't believe in the idea of reincarnation, but reincarnation is nevertheless true in the sense of all the bodies of living things that die are then reassembled into other living things. Animals that die, their bodies break down into the earth and plants grow in that enriched nutrient soil, and then they're eaten by other plants. It's a cycle. And engaging with the idea that we are going to die to some extent frees you from fear in different contexts. I guess that's the path that it's taken me.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. So there is this physiological aspect of freediving, and I wonder if you could just briefly speak to that in terms of our own physical bodies and actually this approach to training ourselves to perform these deep dives without the aid of any equipment.
You know, as far as we know, humans have been breath hold divers for as long as there have been humans. We still only partially understand what enables deep and sustained diving. We do know a suite of things, and those are that initially when you're immersed, particularly in cold water, your heart rate drops. And as you progress your time in the ocean, your blood moves from your extremities into your core in a process which they call vasoconstriction, when your blood vessels get smaller and push the blood towards your heart. And they call that movement to call blood shift. As you stay down or go deeper, eventually your spleen contracts and releases oxygen-rich blood into the body to compensate for the fact that you haven't been taking in oxygen in any other way. That series of three physiological responses is one of the reasons why people can dive deeply and stay down for quite a long time. As you go deeper, your lungs compress to the size of your fists and fluid moves into the space that's created there, because you can't have an empty space when you've got increasing atmospheres of pressure on your body. We're still working on understanding everything that happens, because competitive freedivers continue to push past the limits of what was thought possible. People regularly dive to more than 100 meters with absolutely no equipment. But the fact that that's possible says quite remarkable things about why the human body is adapted to do that. And what I found fascinating about that is our ancient biological connection to oceans, the fact that all life comes out of the sea. We have a continuous thread taking us back to our origin as marine animals. And we have the physiology that reflects that connection.
So rather than this being something unnatural that we're forcing ourselves to do, it's in fact something completely natural that we're almost remembering that we have the capability to perform.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting element. When we are in embryo in the womb, we're in the tiny sea of the amniotic sac. During that 9 months, there are stages where we have gills. But then when a human infant is born, you can immerse an infant in water and he or she will open her eyes, hold her breath, and start to swim breaststroke, like completely unstressed by the experience. It reflects that continuity of connection to oceans. You can look at the fluids in our body, our tears, our blood, the amniotic fluid, our salt composition reflects the salt composition in ancient oceans itself. In some respects, we carry the sea inside us.
Thank you for listening to the Big Deep podcast.
Next time on Big Deep.
It's this 6-foot diameter sphere, and they fit 3 of you in there. And during the safety tour, they're like, don't press this lever. And we're like, well, what does that do? And they're like, well, it'll shoot the sphere you're in away from the sub all the way to the surface. And we don't know how fast that goes. And I remember thinking, great, I can't wait to die that way.
We really appreciate you being with us on this journey into the Big Deep as we explore an ocean of stories.
If you like what we were doing, please make sure to subscribe, like, and comment on our show in iTunes, Overcast, SoundCloud, or wherever you catch your podcasts. But those subscribes and likes really make a difference.
For more info on our guests, extra audio and photos, as well as updates on anything you've heard, you can find a lot more content at our website, bigdeep.com.
Plus, if you know someone you think we should talk to, just let us know at the Big Deep website, as we are always looking to hear more stories from interesting people who are deeply connected to our world's oceans.
Thanks again for joining us.